Only an honorable man would give his life to protect his people.
The show starts at the aftermath of a battle between the two kingdoms of Brune and Zhcted. A lone bowman and an Earl, Tigrevurmud Vorn, is looking for any Brune survivors, but he is only able to spot the enemy general, a maiden clad in armor, a Vanadis, Eleonora Viltaria. With only 5 arrows in possession and several miles from the target, he shoots at Elen, but the maiden repels all arrows with her sword. And just when Tigra thought his life was over, she tells him that he belongs to her now. The next day, Tigra finds himself in enemy territory, late merits, and Elen asks him to demonstrate his bow skills. But due to a faulty bow, Tigra misses the first 2 marks. Just then, he notices a cloaked man firing an arrow at Princess Elen, but Elen manages to protect herself. Tigra uses his faulty bow to shoot the foot of the assassin several miles from his location, and impressing everyone. Days pass and Tigra starts to fit in, and one day, while wandering around, he spots a baby dragon that belongs to Elen, who is taking a bath. Elen asks the flustered Vorn once again to become hers. At night, Tigra contemplates Elen's offer, but is suddenly told that a Brune man is caught. Tigra rushes to find that the intruder is Bertrand, his attendant, who informs him that Earl Thurnadir is marching for Tigra's hometown, Alses, with 3,000 soldiers. Angry, Tigra rushes to leave but is halted by Elen. With the prince dead, the Brune kingdom is in a state of civil war with House Ganelon and House Thenardier, both aiming to seize the throne. Thenardier gives his 2 dragons and 3,000 soldiers to his son, Zion, to seize Alses. Meanwhile, instead, Elen berates Tigra for trying to charge alone, and just then, Tigra asks Elen to lend him some troops. She laughs at a prisoner asking for troops, but accepts in return for the territory of Alses, and so they march for Alses. As Thenardier's army marches, the people at Alses take refuge in the temple, but Tita, Tigra's maid, decides to wait at the Vorn manor with Tigra's bow. Soon, the army starts pillaging the town, but the people are all safe. Frustrated, Zion decides to destroy the Vorn manor, only to find Tita waiting for her master. He starts attacking her, and just as he's about to lay his hands on her, an arrow pierces his hand. Tigra rushes in and saves Tita. Elen's army starts marching towards the enemy. Tita hands Tigra his bow that was given to him by his father, only to be used when the need arises. The battle commences and Elen's army kills 300 of the enemies, but Zion manages to retreat to Molshame Plains with the rest. At Zion's camp, he orders his army of 2,700 to be divided in 3. At Alses, Elen decides to lead 600 men with Vorn and order her second, Lim, to take the rest. And Tigra has an idea that utilizes the spare horses. Soon, the 2 armies face each other. Elen unsheaths her blade Arifat, a sword that controls wind, and leads the charge. As Elen's forces are overpowering the enemy advance their land dragon. Elen confidently points her sword at the dragon and releases her largest attack, Lay Admas, slicing the dragon in 2. The corned Zion challenges Tigra to a duel, but berates him when Tigra uses a bow for the duel. Tigra manages to pierce Zion's shield by shooting at the exact same spot. Just then, Tigra uses the spear horses to create a camouflage of 2,000 troops, making Zion ride the flying dragon and run away. Suddenly, a voice calls for Tigra to shoot and his bow starts to glow. The bow borrows power from Elen's sword, and Tigra shoots down the dragon, killing Zion. Days pass and life at Alses is normal. Elen leaves Lim with Tigra and heads for an audience with Zhted's king. Meanwhile, Thenardier decides to send the assassin group Sarash after Vorn and handle a war maiden with another. At Zhted's capital, King Victor questions Elen for her involvement in Brune, to which she replies that she had been hired by Tigra. Though the king is unsatisfied, at that moment, another Vanadis, Sophia Obertes, intervenes and pleads Elen's case. After the meeting, Elen meets Vanadis Milla, and the two seem to be at odds. Later, Sophie reveals that even though Milla dislikes it, she is an associate of Thenardier. Meanwhile at Vorn Manor, General Mashas is back, and Tigra tells him that he'll fight Thenardier for Alses' sake. Mascias heads to the capital to appeal Tigra's case to the king, and so Tigra allies with neighboring earls. A few days later, Milla intrudes on a meeting between Elen and Vorn, asking Tigra to accompany her. On their way, they are attacked by Seresh assassins. During the battle, Lim gets poisoned, but Tigra sucks it out, all while Milla takes care of the assassins. Now in Roderick, Lim has recovered, and after touring the market, Milla leaves. A few days later, as Elen has predicted, Milla marches for late merits, while Thenardier attempt to attack Alses. The armies of two Vanadis face off at Burkina Plains, but the battle remains in a stalemate state. An enraged Elen rallies her soldiers to siege Milla's castle in Tatra Mountains, but the Milla proves to live up to her reputation for being the Vanadis who's best at defense. Elen recklessly tries to charge the castle alone, but Tigra stops her, saying that he'll find an alternative route to the castle. Vorn, now disgusted as a hunter, scouts the mountain for a couple of days, and one day crosses paths with Milla. The two have a fun chat over tea, and Milla departs after Tigra gives her the name Urs. Tigra traces Milla's steps and finds the path to the castle. Later, he leads Elen and the army to the castle, but even Elen's rifle isn't able to break the fortified door. With the castle alerted, Tigra borrows power from Arifel and shoots an arrow, breaching the door. Inside, Elen and Milla are equally matched. That is when they are interrupted by a Serash, but Tigra shoots him and reveals to Milla that he was in reality Urs. Surprised, Milla announces that she'll not be involving herself in Brune's civil war anymore. As if he had predicted this, Thenardier sends a message to the mightiest Brune knight Roland, the owner of the invincible sword Durandal, to take care of Tigra the traitor. 1 month passes after the scuffle with Milla. Tigra has amassed 5,000 troops, and Elen named the army the Silver Meteor Storm. Later that day, while relaxing alone, Tigra comes across a naked Sophie and Elen, who informs Tigra that he has been branded a traitor by a royal decree. Tigra stands with his cause and convinces his allies to fight Roland's Navarre Knights. A few days later, the two forces clash. Roland overpowers the forces, and even Elen finds it difficult to protect herself against him. Forced into a corner, Elen is saved by Tigra, who skillfully uses his bow to kill Roland's mount. Just as Elen starts celebrating, she realizes that Tigra is severely injured. With the Navarre Knights advancing, Sophie appears and stalls the group alone, while Elen escapes. After getting overpowered by Roland, Sophie too escapes, and General Mascias appear, leading 300 troops, forcing the Navarre Knights to retreat. At the camp, Tita takes care of Tigra, who's in a serious condition. Meanwhile, Mascias lets the group know that he never got an audience with the king because the king is not in the right state of mind, implying the conspiracy against Vorn. The next day, the two armies once again clash. Meanwhile, Tigra wakes up and his bow leads him to an ominous temple. Tita explains that the temple belongs to the goddess of night, darkness and death, TI NAFA. Suddenly, Tita is possessed by the goddess, who asks Tigra to shoot Tita to show his resolve to protect. He manages to shoot Tita without harming her and knocking out the goddess. After claiming Tita, Tigra rushes towards the battlefield. Meanwhile, Elen separates Roland from the main force and faces him together with Sophie. Elen activates Arifel against Roland, a human, but he easily counters it with Durandal. As Sophie and Elen are cornered, Tigra arrives and fires a powerful arrow utilizing the full power of his bow. He tries to counter it but is overpowered. Defeated, Roland surrenders and the battle ends. After telling Tigra that he'll plead his case to the king, Roland heads for the capital. But before he could get an audience, Ganelon traps Roland in a room and releases 1,000 venomous bees. Roland dies standing after being stung to death. Meanwhile, Elen departs after receiving a letter from Sasha, a fellow Vanadis, who needs Elen's help to ward off another Vanadis attacking Legnica. With the mightiest knight gone, Brune's southern border is invaded by Muzino's 20,000 troops, who take citizens as slaves. Tigra's army heads south. Days later, on the way back from a scouting mission, Tigra spots a couple of Muzino soldiers chasing a runaway slave. Tigra shoots them and saves the blonde-haired slave. In the evening, when the enemy commander Kashim is made aware of the presence of Tigra's 200 troops, he sends 3,000 men for them just to be trapped by Tigra's men. Slowly through the days, Tigra's forces ambush the enemy and dwindle their numbers. Soon, Kashim orders the execution of 10 slaves to lure Tigre, and he disappears with his 600 troops. And as the troops clash, Tigre shoots an arrow through Kashim's head from 300 alsin away. With the commander gone, the enemy starts retreating, but the sense of victory is short-lived when main army of 30,000 troops appear. And just as all hope is lost, Milla appears with her army to save Tigre. In the past, we see Sasha making Milla and Elen get along after demonstrating her power. Back in the present, Elen and Lim meet the bedridden Sasha. She tells them about the conspiracy that led to the Vanadis Elizaveta Fomina attacking Legnica. Elen pledges to fight Liza for Sasha's sake, whom Elen holds in high regards. Meanwhile at Agnes, Milla and Tigre discuss battle tactics to defeat the enemy's overwhelming number. Later, Tigre goes to meet the blonde runaway he saved and feeds her. At Legnica, Elen's troop face Liza and the two Vanadis face each other in combat. Elen manages to push Liza back, but in order to reach Tigre in time, the two agree to a ceasefire treaty. Meanwhile at Agnes, Milla suggests a plan to take down the formidable enemy general Barbaros, who leads the main army. Tigre agrees to try the reckless tactic. Barbaros divides his army into 7 divisions, all protecting the general. The battle, later dubbed as Ormea campaign, starts on the snowy hills. Tigre's troops gave the idea that they had taken the hilltop as a base, and the slaves have started retreating. Barbaros orders half of his divisions to surround the hill and half to chase the slave. But while the army is chasing after the slaves, the hidden army led by Tigre and Milla attack the main division of the army. And the slaves, now revealed to be troops in disguise, turn back and attack the enemy, while real slaves are safe at the hilltop. But due to Tigre's troops reaching their limit, they are caught between 2 of enemy's divisions. Meanwhile, Barbaros cautiously moves out of Tigre's bow range. Just as all hope is lost, 3 orders of night come in as reinforcements with 5,000 troops. Without giving enemy any time, Mashes also arrives with thousands of troops, making the enemy retreat. The morning, Barbaros gets the report that his forces at the ports are defeated by Thenardier, and he decides to call off the campaign. The Tigre camp is finally at peace. Later that night, Elen and Tigre stare at the starry sky as they hold hands. The next day, the slave that Tigre saved, named Regin, asks for an audience with him. Regin confesses that she has lived under the name of Regnus as the Prince of Brune, and he didn't die in battle. And she was able to verify her identity to Vorn, leaving everyone flabbergasted. But in order to prove her royal heritage, Tigre decides to take Regin to Ganelon territory, Lutetia, as there is a holy grotto there that only the royal family know how to enter. Elsewhere, Thenardier is now in possession of 5 dragons. Meanwhile, Ganelon, who's aware of Princess's existence, decides to lay a trap. Tigre gets the news of Lutetia burning and immediately marches with his troops for Lutetia. But they face Thenardier's army at Vincennes Plains on their way. The troops face off against each other, while the 2 Vanadis take on the dragons. The 2 are able to take down 3 of the dragons with relative ease, but the other 2 prove to be more ferocious, making the Vanadis retreat. The day ends in a draw. The next morning, the duo attack the dragons using hack-and-slash tactics, and destroy the beasts, leaving the rest to Vorn. With a recent victory against Thenardier, Tigre heads for the Holy Grotto through the Temple of Mosia. During the march, Bertrand expressed his will to go with Tigre, and he agreed. Inside the temple, Regin leads the troops through the underground caverns to the Holy Grotto, but what lay at the end of the cavern shocked them. It was Thenardier and his troops. Elen fights off Thenardier, while Tigre takes on his second-in-command Stide. During the fight, the cavern begins to collapse, which was Ganelon's trap, and troops rush to the entrance, but Tigre is held up by Stide. Just as Stide is about to cut Vorn, Bertrand takes the blow and the cave collapses. Upon regaining consciousness, Tigre finds a crushed Stide, and later, Bertrand, who's taking his last few breaths. Tigre takes the dying Bertrand in his hands, and Bertrand bids farewell to his young master, passing away without worries. Outside, Elen and the rest head to the collapsed entrance, but spot an explosion of energy. The relieved Elen hurries to find Tigre and a dead Bertrand in a crater. Later at the camp, the troops prepare for the final clash with Thénardier, but Tigre's condition is unsure. At night, Elen goes to talk with the depressed Tigre to help and regain his pride and mettle for his people, and he finally goes back to the old Tigre. The next day, the Prime Minister visits Tigre to let him know about the king's recovery and that he was poisoned by Ganelon. Finally, Tigre announces his march to defeat Thénardier and restore Regent's position. A few days later, the two forces clash, but with Stade dead, Thénardier's army is in disarray. Tigre faces Thénardier, asks him why he attacked Alses, but when Tigre doesn't sense any feeling of regret, he accepts Thénardier's challenge for a duel. The two face off, but when Tigre tries to use the hatred inside of him, Elen slaps him and reminds him not to let hatred take over. Tigre regains his composure and shoots an arrow towards Thénardier. The arrow shifts position midway and bolts straight through Thénardier's head, and with his death, the battle comes to a close. Days later, Tigre and the gang are welcomed into the capital with a royal procession, and they finally get an audience with the king. The king accepts Tigre's requests and makes Regent the next rightful ruler of Brune. The king also makes Tigre a Lumiere knight, and it is later revealed that many previous Lumiere have gone to become kings. Tigre goes back to Zhcted with Elen as agreed, and towards the end, Elen is glad to have met Tigre. The end.